Okay, cool. Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me and there are no technical issues. If there are, please let me know in the chat function and we'll get that sorted at our end. However, we would like to thank you for joining us today and would like to welcome you to our third instalment of the Women in Planning Lunch Bites webinar series. My name is Beth Pywell and I'm the Vice Chair of the Women in Planning West Midlands Committee, and I'm also a Senior Planner here at CBRE. Today's session is going to be led by Sophia Gibson. Sophia is an Associate Director and Social Value Lead at CBRE, where she is supporting CBRE's investors and asset manager clients to understand the social impact of their real estate portfolios and how they can identify opportunities for delivering value to the communities that their assets are a part of. In her previous role at the UK Green Building Council, Sophia led the Social Value Programme and co-authored a number of best practice guidance documents on social value in real estate. In this session, she will introduce the concept of social value in real estate and the opportunity that there is to consider social value at the planning stage. The presentation will last approximately 30 minutes with a 15-minute Q&A opportunity at the end. As usual, if you do have any questions, please do note them in the chat function and we'll pick these up as and when. Please do make sure to add your email address to your question, and if we don't get to it today, we can get in touch with you separately. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Women in Planning YouTube channel later on today. I will now hand over to Sophia.
Great, thank you, Beth. Thanks for that introduction and also the opportunity to come along today and speak to you all about social value in real estate. Next slide, please. So I think Beth did a pretty comprehensive introduction, but yeah, I'm social value lead within CBRE and we are growing a team who are looking at meeting our clients' needs around social value. Our sort of primary focus is with our investor and asset management clients, our corporate occupiers, and of course developers, which is, I guess, one of the key audiences of interest in terms of today's discussion and the focus that we have on planning. So what I'm going to go through is a kind of introduction to what we mean by social value within the context of the built environment, within the context of real estate. I'm going to look at social value policy. It's particularly gnarly subject, particularly when we come to planning policy. I'm going to talk through our social value snapshot, which is a proprietary tool that CBRE has developed to measure the social impact of real assets. And then I'm going to talk a bit more about social value in planning. And I'm really pleased that today's session has a good chunk of time at the end for questions and discussion, because I think it's a really interesting area to get all of your thoughts on, because it is an emerging practice. It's something that's not immediately straightforward. There's definitely some clunky things that need to be ironed out, but I'll outline sort of what our thinking is and the thinking with other networks I'm connected to, such as the UK GBC and the Social Value Portal, who also have been doing work in this area, and it would be great to have a discussion at the end about that. Next slide, please. So social value and in social value in the context of real estate. Next slide, please. So starting with sort of some of the widest possible context, why do people suddenly matter? You know, there has been a huge explosion of interest in the business world about what social impact is, what social value is, and the kind of the role that businesses play within society. So why now? Obviously, the pandemic has played into that. All of us being at home with our communities, reflecting on what we do and our contribution to society. That's surely part of it. Also, the fact that we're in a not particularly positive place in the UK in terms of the data on inequality. Inequality is rising across the UK, and that chart from the top is about people who are actually working in poverty and how that's on the increase. But also it's getting increasingly important because of social media, and I've got a kind of nice buildings related example here, which is, some of you may have seen this, it went viral on Twitter a month or so ago. It's a image of one of the newest Amazon distribution centres in Mexico, and you can see a stark contrast between this big shiny Amazon building and the extreme levels of deprivation that are surrounding it. And that's something that could only be shone a spotlight on in the kind of hyper social mediaized world that we live in today. And so increasingly, important that these things are being picked up by businesses first before they're picked up by someone on social media and labeling them as dystopian. There was also an article, really interesting article written by Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, in The Economist. This was actually probably in the first part of the pandemic, talking about how, or kind of anticipating how the pandemic would impact our global economy. And I pulled out this quote from that article. In which he says that he believed that fundamentally the traditional drivers of value will be shaken and that new ones will gain prominence. And there's a possibility that the gulf between what markets value and what people value will close. And I think this is really interesting because, of course, what people value is social value. Next slide, please. So what are sort of the key drivers for businesses, not just in the UK, but across Europe and globally? Well, the first, obviously, we have the UK Public Services in brackets Social Value Act that came into force in January 2013. That puts a requirement on all public sector bodies to consider social value in their award of contracts. This has recently been strengthened through the introduction of a social value model, which sets out specific outcomes and recommended assessment criteria that any public sector body, so we're talking central government bodies here, not local authorities, they're bound under the same act, but they have their own frameworks. So we had that model, that framework for assessing, accounting for social value within the award of contracts. So that's a sort of key driver. Secondly, the rise of ESG, the fact that it's become such a prominent part of business as usual, but also what's been recognised that the S of ESG is not as robust and credible as it needs to be. And so we need to do more work in that area. Thirdly, thinking about just the driver to be a responsible business, and that's something that all of us do every day when we turn up to work, and we want the organisations that we work for to deliver more than just financial returns for shareholders. We want them to have a positive impact on society. Customer demand, this is particularly important when we're thinking about, well, in the built environment context, retail assets, so where you need to have a shopping centre delivering in the needs of the community, otherwise you won't have any shoppers, you won't have any business, so it becomes business critical. And then lastly, the EU taxonomy, which some of you might be familiar with. It's a classification system within the EU for understanding sustainability, and they are expanding the scope of what that covers to include social factors. Exactly what that looks like has not yet been announced. But it's likely that it will follow the same kind of framing that we get from the existing EU taxonomy. It's just that we will cover more key areas such as employment inequality, etc. So that's just an overview of some of the key drivers for thinking about social value. Next slide, please. But what do we mean by social value? So it sounds like an obvious question. It's actually quite a confusing term in and of itself. Social value encompasses environmental, economic and social well-being. So it's not social sustainability. It's actually much more holistic than that. The social element is that it sees all of those elements in terms of how they improve the quality of life of people. So it's holistic in terms of scope. The second important thing is who the beneficiary of social value is particularly important. So this diagram that you can see on the slides shows sort of concentric circles which illustrate different stakeholder groupings that might benefit from the social value delivered through a particular building or place. So the closest concentric circle is, of course, the local community. So the people who live, work, interact with a building or place on a day-to-day basis. They would be your first grouping. The second would be the supply chain. So anyone who's in the supply chain that's associated with the construction and operation of a building. Next one up would be sort of the wider town or city. So if we're thinking about a regeneration project, how that can have value for the wider city. And then lastly, global society as a stakeholder. So we can see things like the reduction of carbon emissions on a project, and that is something that has an impact on us as global citizens. Generally, when we're talking about social value, we're wanting to prioritize the stakeholders who are sort of in the inner concentric circles of this diagram. So really focusing on the local community and the supply chain. However, it doesn't mean that those other supply chains, those other stakeholders shouldn't be recognised as well. So that kind of explanation hopefully is summed up in the text on the right-hand side. This is a definition that the UK Green Building Council has put out of social value in real estate. This is something that, it was the last bit of work that I did at the UK Green Building Council before coming over to CBRE, but it was done very much in collaboration with the whole of the industry. We had the RICS, we had REBA, British Property Federation, BBP, key private sector organisations, all agreeing that this is what we meant by social value in the context of the built environment. So I'll just read it out. Social value is created when buildings, places and infrastructure support our environmental, economic and social well-being, and in so doing improve the quality of life of people. So hopefully that kind of gives us a good grounding for what we mean by social value. Next slide, please. In terms of how we deliver social value, this is actually where, at least for me, things become even more interesting, because it's actually the process and the approach that we undertake on any project, which is the guarantee of leading to the best results for those stakeholders mentioned before. So again, this diagram illustrates a framework for delivering social value in a built environment project, which was co-created by the organisations whose logos are on the left-hand side. You'll notice within this diagram the importance of local information and local needs, and in fact we've got what we call a golden thread of community involvement, which is supposed to go through all steps in the process for delivering social value. And that's really at the core of what we're talking about. So taking each of these in turn, the first step is to identify your stakeholders. Who are you talking about? Who are the ones who are most most important within a particular context? Secondly, understand their best interests, both through secondary and primary data. Thirdly, agree outcomes collaboratively. So work with those stakeholders to agree what are the social value outcomes that you'll want to see from a particular project. And then you can and those are sort of the three most important steps, and that helps you define what social value means for a particular project. And from there, you can establish a baseline, create a strategy, put in place a measurement framework, and then you go into implementation and ongoing monitoring. Ongoing monitoring is actually a really important part of this. Quite often you will get commitment to deliver social value, and then the teams drop away, they get involved in other things, and there's no one there to commit to the ongoing monitoring of social value commitments. So we need a better join up between the property management, the facilities management, the asset management side of things, and any commitments that have been made on new development. But hopefully that gives you an idea of sort of best practice social value delivery on a real estate project. Next slide, please. So social value policy. There is a real emerging area. It's a moving, something that's sort of very much a moving feast. That's both in terms of how it's embedded through central government bodies, but also the fact that there is a responsibility on all local authorities to consider social value within their procurement policies. But exactly what that looks like and how far they go with it is completely up to the local authority. So there's a huge amount of diversity within social value policy. Next slide, please. So starting with the kind of basics, so obviously in the UK we have the Public Services Act, which I spoke through before, which has been strengthened recently with the introduction of the social value model. That's part of Procurement Policy Note 620, which is definitely worth a look if you have public sector clients. In Scotland, they have the Procurement Reform Act, and in Wales, they have the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Different terminology. For the most part, it amounts to similar stuff, similar responses. And then, of course, we have all of the individual local authority requirements, which I mentioned before. At the moment, about 50% of local authorities have a social value policy. This is typically one that's at the corporate level. So it's not necessarily specific to procurement or planning or anything else, land disposal, for example. But that's sort of the saturation, I guess, of social value considerations within local authorities. So there's no guarantee that you will meet specific requirements when you're engaging with a local authority. The recent changes in policy I've really covered off. So the strengthening of the Social Value Act. The social value model was published at the back end of last year. It's the first iteration, so I think that will continually be refined and updated and improved. So we're really kind of at the beginning with what that exactly looks like and how sophisticated those assessment criteria are. So one definitely to watch, and something that there's real commitment from our government to continue to resource. Secondly, which is a really interesting area for this discussion, emerging local planning policy. So we're at the moment, and I'll come on to these exactly, there's 2 local authorities who have a social value policy within their local plan. They've articulated it differently, but it's something that local authorities are seeing as being valuable. I think the planning teams within those local authorities have recognised the value that the procurement teams are able to derive for communities and are wanting to replicate that within the planning context. But we'll come on a bit more to that later. And then PPN 620, that's the Procurement Policy Note 620 that I mentioned before, which includes the social value model, which was the bit of information that was launched at the back end of last year. Next slide, please. So the specific policies, so this is the one that Islington Council have. This, I should say, neither of these are in the adopted plans. I believe that's yet to be the case that they are published in the adopted plans. But this one requires that any developer submit a social value self-assessment as part of the planning process. So if you go on to the next slide, so that's Islington. And then the other one is Salford City Council, and they have slightly different wording, but their requirement is to have a social value strategy for that particular development. So you can see they're slightly different. So Islington, it's about the developer looking at themselves as an organisation and doing an assessment of their own social value, whereas the one for Salford is more about the project and the social value that can be delivered on projects. So only 2 local authorities that have put this out there so far, but already you can see there's quite different requirements coming through. I also included Bristol City Council just because they had a commitment, a public commitment to introduce social value into their local plan, but it's got a bit quiet, so we might be waiting a bit longer for more information on that one. Next slide, please. So all of that information is within a resource that is held by the UK Green Building Council. It's primarily for local authorities, kind of looking at their options for driving social value in real estate and new development. So looking at procurement, because obviously that is a lever, looking at planning, and then also looking at land disposal. So if you're interested to find out more or to see specific examples of specific policies, I highly recommend going to this document. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about a specific real estate project, there's a lot of different social value related things that are interacting. And this is a diagram that we tried to set out some of those policy and how they're interacting. So sort of at the top, you've got the international framework, such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the EU legislation, and then the level down from that, you've got specific social value policy. So be it the local authority policy, be it the national policy, be it other central government resources such as the Green Book, Treasury Green Book, which obviously has supplementary guidance on wellbeing valuation, which is really relevant to this conversation. And then you've got all of the other policy and all the other frameworks which overlap heavily with what we're looking at in a social value context. And all of these things sort of are supposed to come together on a particular project, which can feel a bit messy. The way that we're thinking about sorting through this is the fact that everything that is listed out here, all of the requirements that are kind of interacting in this map on the slide, they all require us to have a reasonable understanding and a way to measure social value. So that brings me on quite nicely to the social value snapshot and the tool that CBRE has developed around measuring social value. Next slide, please. So it's a proprietary tool. It's something that has been in development at CBRE for 3 years. It's a tool for looking backwards, measuring the social impact of real assets. It's based around asset performance. That's sort of its USP. But it's also a tool for looking forward and recognising opportunities to deliver value based on local needs data. Next slide, please. So this is probably the most important slide out of the whole deck. So if you listen to anything, listen to this. So the most fundamentally important thing to understand when measuring social value, and the key difference between measuring social value compared to environmental impact, is that measuring environmental impact is a relatively objective exercise. So a kilogram of water, waste or carbon will be pretty much the same anywhere across the UK. Whereas when we're thinking about social intervention and social impact, that is very much not the case. So the example that I always give is of a bus stop. If you introduced a bus stop to a community that already have one, it would create a negligible amount of social value. Whereas if you introduced a bus stop to a community that didn't have a bus stop already, that would create a large amount of social value. So the social impact, the magnitude of the social impact that we claim has to be based on local needs data. It has to depend on that. And the kind of added layer of complexity to that is that obviously our needs and the demographics of communities can change dramatically within short geographical distances. So on the slide, there's a graphic of a part of Bristol where I live, which shows 2 wards next to each other. The ward on the left is in the 20% least deprived wards in the whole of the UK, and the ward on the right is in the 10% most deprived. And it's a 5-minute walk to get from one side of the left ward to the other. So huge differences in demographics, huge differences in needs. And this is something that all of us can recognise probably from our experience of the towns and cities that we live in. We have huge differences in demographics within relatively small geographical areas. So what the tool does is it takes that into account. It gathers that data at the hyperlocal level. Next slide, please. So the tool, going into how that works, it covers, in terms of scope, it covers the 10 thematic areas that you can see listed out on the right-hand side. These themes speak to what we think are the key ways that the built environment provides value to communities and wider stakeholders. So it makes us feel safe and secure, it can provide employment, it can improve our health, it can provide a healthy environment, it can support community, improve connectivity, be a resilient, climate resilient asset, and it can respond to our needs around diversity and inclusion. Each of those thematic areas has 5 to 6 indicators within each of the theme, and each of those indicators is made up of local area data and asset performance data. So there's information about the building, there's information about the local area, and that produces a score. The local area data also sits alongside that score because it tells us something rich and important about the area that that building is in. Next slide, please. So where we see it sitting within the market, we think it's unique in that it's built around asset performance. So it's specific to the built environment. There's quite a lot of tools out there about contract performance because of the nature of the Social Value Act. But this tool is around asset performance. Secondly, as I said before, it's a tool for looking backwards and forwards. So it's about measuring social value and identifying opportunities to deliver social value. And thirdly, the point that I made just now, which is that we're looking at hyper local area data and we're putting a real focus on local needs. So that's where we see it sitting within the market. Next slide, please. And how do we ensure a robust and credible approach? Well, this is a kind of ongoing piece of work for us. We are continuing to partner with the UK Green Building Council. We're partners on their social value programme, and we're continuing to ensure that our approach is aligned with the framework that they set out for delivering social value. That's, you know, very much in a similar way that you would for net zero, for example. Secondly, we draw only from nationally available data sets, which have their own robust methodologies. So those kind of things are governed by the ONS. Thirdly, we keep it compared to other tools out there in the market and making sure we're aligned where possible. We're in close conversations with GRESB about how we ensure that we continue to connect with them. And then when we introduce financial proxies into the calculation exercise, we'll make sure that those are in line with the UK government's Green Book guidance on social value measurement. Next slide, please. So this is, we're finally coming to sort of the heart of it, which is social value in the context of planning. And I think the first thing to flag up here is kind of what I was saying before, that this is a really emerging area. It's a really interesting area. I don't think anyone has all the answers yet. I think there's definitely been numerous conversations about whether it's a necessary thing. The NPPF sets out that the whole point of the planning system is to deliver economic, environmental and social benefits to people within a particular area. And that is almost verbatim what we see in the Social Value Act. So one kind of query is, well, what's the point of overlaying social value onto that? Isn't that what the whole planning system is supposed to deliver anyway? I think it's a really interesting point. I think it's a really valid point. The counter to it, I suppose, is when we think practically. So practically speaking, we know that the existing legislation is not as successful as we would want it to be in delivering specific value to communities in the process in all instances. So we know that there's like an issue to be resolved there. And then perhaps more importantly, we know that people are finding it useful. We know that developers are finding it useful to design social value strategies for developments, even when they haven't been asked to, and submitting those as part of planning because they think it's a really important way to speak to the value that they are bringing to that community and to the wider local authority. And you know, it is also being recognised by local authorities as something that they can it be getting a lot of value out of? So if you think of someone like Manchester City Council, who have a 40% weighting for social value in their procurement processes, and have been really successful in driving benefits from their public spend to their communities through that, why wouldn't they try and replicate the same in terms of new development? In fact, it's even more important to do that in context because the buildings have such a great connection with communities and people's day-to-day lives. But yeah, happy to kind of continue that conversation in the questions section. Next slide, please. Oh, this probably needs some clicking on so that it's all of the brilliant. Thank you. So this was a kind of exercise that was undertaken by a working group that I'm connected to with Social Value Portal, if you're familiar with their work, about, when can a local authority ask developers to submit information about social value at the planning stage? So sort of almost a decision tree to show the different instances. So the first question would be, does the local plan include a social value policy? So yes, that's true for Islington and Salford, but for the vast majority not. So we go down the right of the decision tree. Is the project EIA? If it is, then we think that a social value assessment can be required as an EIA chapter, and that's something that we're looking at CBRE. So I sit within an EIA team, and that is a product that we're looking to develop. What it would do is look at all of the other chapters and bring out sort of the highlights of those in terms of the benefits that they bring to people and summarize them in one chapter, and really kind of bring to light the overall contribution that project brings to a specific community group. So that's something we're very much looking at. If it's not an EIA, is there a supplementary planning document which has outcomes and objectives which are aligned to what we mean by social value? If yes, it could be that a social value statement, assessment, strategy could be required to show alignment to that SPD. And then if not, perhaps that local authority has a corporate social value policy, and if so, again, that documentation could demonstrate alignment to that. This is, I think, quite a useful theoretical exercise to kind of get to grips with where it could crop up, and it almost maps it. I think, from the direct experience that people have had, both from the developer side and the local authority side, sometimes it just feels like it's a use, if it's particularly sensitive development, it's a particularly sensitive community, having a social value assessment of the proposed development or having a social value strategy for that proposed development feels like a really sensible thing to be submitting at the planning stage. Next slide, please. So in terms of how we would use the social values tool that I ran through before to get to the point where we have an assessment or a strategy. This is sort of our three-step process. So the first one is to establish the baseline. So that's where we would run the social value snapshot across the local area and the proposal in question. If there's not a proposal in question, which slightly different for this instance, but sometimes we have conversations where there isn't a proposal, but they just want a local area assessment, we can produce that at that point. So that's almost kind of ancillary. But assuming there is a proposal, so you've run the tool across what that proposal is and also on the local area information. And then step two is to assess that information, to kind of pull out the insights, to recognise the opportunities perhaps for creating additional value, and for looking at creating social return on investment calculations for some of that things as well. Sorry, you might be able to hear my cat in the corner, gets very needy for lunch about this time, so apologies if he pipes up again. And that would be the social value assessment, and then from that point you can create a strategy. So this is the kind of the steps that we would undertake in order to create a strategy, and the strategy would include sort of outcomes, targets, KPIs, and a roadmap for delivery. It's worth mentioning actually that we're currently recruiting a social value economist to come into our team so that they can conduct social cost benefit analysis, which is obviously the monetization of social value. So that will really enhance the kind of process that I've outlined here. Next slide, please. And then looking at that in terms of the rest of our social value offering, you can see the third client type at the bottom, developer. We've been working with developers to create social value policies for them as an organisation, so they understand kind of what their own requirements are around social value, so they can push those through their supply chain. Actually, interestingly, formatting those, it depends heavily on sort of who the local authorities are that they're working with and whether they have any public sector investment. But yeah, that's one bit of work we do with developers. The second bit is what I've just talked through before. So undertaking that assessment, either providing a local area assessment or a social value assessment, or framing that as a social value chapter within an EIA. And then the strategy that relates to developers, of course, creating a social value strategy for a new development. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of where we're starting to go and where we're starting to think there's opportunity. If you go on to the next slide. This is the team at the moment. As I said before, we're getting in another economist. We're getting hopefully an analyst in sort of halfway through next year. And that speaks to kind of like the demand that we're seeing from both our investor and asset management clients, but actually much more than we thought from developer clients. So hopefully it's going to be a really interesting space to watch from that perspective. And yeah, that's it. Last slide, I think, is just thanks for listening and any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Sophia. Oh, sorry, I can hear an echo. Is that? I'm not sure why it's coming through. Sorry.
I can't hear an echo, so I think you're right.
Okay, cool. That's great. Let's just go on my screen then. So I suppose, again, thank you for the presentation today. It was so interesting. And so I know we have kind of had internal discussions around social value, but again, it's really good to kind of get back to the basics, which is kind of what the goal was, obviously, for today's presentation. We have had actually a flurry of questions, so we've probably got about 10 minutes just to run through kind of as many as we can. So I think something I find really interesting is actually how few local planning authorities are implementing a social value policy into their emerging plans. And that actually links to one of our questions, which is, do you think there should be a statutory duty, a statutory requirement for local authorities to have a social value policy in their emerging plans?
I think it would be great if it did. I do have a concern that if things like this are put upon people, it's often rejected. Whereas I think what's happening at the moment is a lot more organic, perhaps slower, maybe a bit frustrating, but you are having departments within local authorities going, this seems like a really good thing that this other local authority is doing. Why aren't we getting benefits in that way? So from that perspective, I think probably what's happening at the moment is the right way. But more conversation that can be happening at a national planning level about social value, the better. Yeah,
definitely. And I suppose in terms of kind of those policies, if there was to be one, I totally see the point though about, people generally don't like being told what to do. It's nicer for it to be a bit more organic. But do you think that would kind of take more of an Islington approach or a Salford approach in terms of kind of asking kind of developers to focus on the kind of the company themselves, or would it be kind of project outcomes? Do you think there's kind of one that should be prioritised, or do you think they're kind of both equally important in their own ways?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. I think it's got to be about the project, but that's not to say that I don't think you can ask some really interesting questions about, what type of organisation you are. I mean, the obvious thing that springs to mind is the fact that there's this rise of B Corp developers, which I think is a great thing. I think they've got some really great parameters for whether that means you're going to develop in the interests of communities. So yeah, the danger, of course, is that if you make it too much about the organisation, you just lose that impact on projects, and it becomes a bit more of a CSR exercise, and that would be a huge shame, because it's got to be about projects, it's got to be about buildings, it's got to be about places. So I'd err towards that one, the Salford approach.
Okay, Salford. Cool. That's really interesting. Thank you. It was something I have been kind of thinking about, and once you mentioned it, I was like, oh, actually, I wonder which way you kind of be leaning on that one. I think something we've had really interestingly, and again, it goes back to that kind of project approach, is this one of the questions, how do you measure locality? Is there kind of a specific standard, or is it kind of very much, again, on that project basis?
Yeah, so I think, our data informs this. So obviously the data that we're getting, the local area data, is at a lower super output area. So that almost creates little Lego blocks of communities that we want to pull together. That's if we're, of course, only relying on secondary data, which, for a new development site, I think you should be investing in getting that primary information. Stakeholder identification is not an easy exercise. It requires resource. It's a bit of an odd one, because I was in a workshop where we were doing this the last week for a project in Cambridge. It's always going to be a little bit chicken and egg. You're almost making a judgment about who's going to benefit from the development when you're deciding who your stakeholder groups are. So, but you have to start somewhere. So you have to kind of like put it out, bring together the key people, bring together some local stakeholders, and find out from them, who are the people who are impacted by this development. I think there's some really interesting digital engagement technologies out there, the ones that send alerts when you walk past the building. So my definition of local community earlier was anyone who interacts with that building or place on a day-to-day basis. We have the technology to be able to send questions to those people. So maybe let's start using that. I know developers who are. So there's lots of different techniques, and it's always going to be approximate, but it needs more resource than it has done previously, I would say.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. I think it's that kind of, as you kind of said, the golden thread is that kind of community involvement very much on. And it's interesting how you define that as, anyone that interacts with that building. It doesn't have to be someone that actually, works there or lives there. It is that kind of passing by effect, I suppose. Kind of, for example, on the commute, I suppose, or something like that, where it might only be something very brief in somebody's day, but it does still kind of have that impact in kind of their built environment and townscape. And I suppose that kind of leads into how do you balance kind of that quantifiable social value versus kind of the more qualitative effects? So kind of, the impact of that place on somebody kind of, I suppose, almost emotionally, etc., versus kind of the quantifiable impact. You've been talking about the potential there is now for kind of calculations, and, kind of having quite empirical data. Is there a balance between quantifiable and qualitative, or, kind of what's your view on that, I suppose?
Yeah, I think it's, again, a really good question. I think it's always good to have a balance between those three. So the qualitative, the quantitative, hopefully I'm putting enough tivs in those, and the monetized. Different audiences will want to see different things. I have a personal belief that monetized social value is not that valuable at the planning stage. I think it can be a distraction. Where I like to encourage that is when we're talking to our investors and asset management clients, where they want to see social return on investment calculations, and you're really talking like, okay, we're putting it into their language. I think in a planning submission, it's very reductive. People do it, and that's fine, and maybe that's what the local authority wants to see. I have a personal preference that I think it's too reductive, but I think it is useful as a comparator, So if you were to if you're putting one social return on investment calculation out there, that's not that helpful. If you're putting several for different scenarios, suddenly that's helpful. So I think, caution, treat with care.
Okay, no, it's really interesting. And I suppose we've had another couple of questions come through, so we'll just kind of try and see how many we can get through. But we're kind of seeing a trend in the questions actually to go back to kind of the local planning and the policy point of view. So one question we've had is, as policies emerging, are local planning authorities content to capture social value in a Section 106? And if not, how do we think those measures will get seen as a benefit in kind of the planning balance, kind of overall planning balance?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a huge conversation about like the transparency of Section 106, you know, whether it's even spent, you know, whether it's kind of being directed to the right things. One thing I would say is that most people are very clear that they want social value delivery to be separate to Section 106 contributions, because the whole point, and this is in the legislation, is that social value is about delivering additional value. So that's something that goes above and beyond compliance, and above and beyond what anyone else would have had to have done within that particular context. So you can't include kind of building regs, so why should you have to include social value? That's not what happens. A lot of people sweep up what is done through Section 106 within their social value contributions, and I'm sure talk about it in terms of their social value strategies on a particular development. I suppose my perspective, and this is a very personal perspective, is that if you want to include it in your social value strategy, you just got to make it very clear that that was part of a Section 106 commitment, and not kind of confuse it as something that you did voluntarily. But that's not policed at all at the moment in the industry.
Okay. Do you think that's something that we will kind of see again increased kind of policy legislation on in the future? Again, as this is all kind of, like you said, it's a moving feast. Do you think that is something that will come eventually, or do you think it's kind of will just be left almost in kind of this ambiguous state for a while?
I think sadly probably not. Like, assurance for the whole social value space is not where it needs to be. You can just basically put anything out there at the moment, which is not good for anyone. So I think there's a lot of people wanting to change that. And it would be great. Like, one of the areas that comes up again and again around assurance is proof of additionality, and Section 106 would have to play into that within the new development context. So I really hope so, and it's something that we're actively, you know, in sort of cross-industry groups talking about with Social Value International, Social Value UK, other bodies. But realistically, I don't think it's something that, you know, will be there for a few years at least.
Yeah. Okay, cool. No, thank you. It's good to hear that kind of insight in terms of that kind of longevity of it, and the fact that it's not going to be an instant win. It is, you know, it's an ongoing process. As with anything to do with planning, you know, it will take time to get sorted. I suppose we have had a question about social value kind of very much at the earlier stages of planning. And I suppose one question that kind of ties to this is, you know, how early should social value begin, and should it begin? And we've had a question from Grace, which is essentially, should social value be a criteria in, for example, site allocation? Should it start that early on in the process? And I suppose, what do you think of that, you know, in terms of, should social value be there at that point in terms of preparing local plans, looking at those allocation requirements? And should it be that early on that, you know, for example, you or any social kind of value professional should be getting involved in projects?
Yeah, definitely. I haven't been so far, but I think it's really important, you know, with anything like this, to have the conversations as early on as possible. And actually, for some of the outcomes we're wanting to see, like diversity of building type, it's critical to have at that point. You can't actually have the conversation later. So, you know, that would definitely be an area to explore. Yeah, keen to talk more with anyone who wants to talk more about that.
Yeah, okay, because I think it would be a really fascinating, I know from kind of doing call for sites from kind of a planning perspective, you know, there's so many tick boxes and areas to look at and investigate that, yeah, definitely there could be, you know, some significant value, you know, as and when, for example, Islington or Salford, etc., start to kind of get that policy in place, you know, looking at potentially tying that in, you know, earlier on, you know, given the way the industry is heading, but probably be, I don't know, we'll have to wait and see, I suppose, what comes out from everything. It would be kind of commonsensical to start the process kind of as early as possible. I'm aware of the time, so we'll probably just go to our final question, which is, what would a kind of social value statement strategy look like in terms of kind of to support a planning application? Kind of how would, you know, you justify it? How would it eventually kind of look in terms of a document, I suppose?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's quite a variety but at its core, so with the assessment, it would have that projected asset performance score across those 10 thematic areas, which you could break down by the 5 to 6 indicators that make up each of those areas, and it would also have the demographic data. If it was part of, if it was a social value chapter within an EIA, I think it would have that information, plus highlighting everything that the EIA had pulled out within the other chapters, and almost showing their relative importance against each other, and almost, I think in both of these, making a assessment, or at least a judgment, of whether there was a net social value benefit from the development, and what were the different component parts of that, but in terms of, you know, the negative impacts and the positive impacts. Social value strategy would look a bit different. It would have that information, that grounding, but it's more looking forward. It's looking at like specific outcomes that are more material to the development in question. So yeah, covering it, all of those 10 elements that I mentioned before, but focusing in on the ones that are most material, and having, you know, KPIs and kind of an implementation strategy for each of those. So those two things are quite different, and then there's a bit more flex in the assessment one.
Yeah, okay. No, that's really interesting, and I think it's not something I've personally come across in terms of planning application, but again, I think as, you know, the emerging trends continue over the next few years, it will definitely be something that kind of as planners we have to get more and more familiar with, and again kind of work with, you know, professionals with social value in terms of how we do implement that into schemes, and into those earlier allocations as well. I am conscious of the time, so I'd just like to say a final thank you again, Sophia, for such an interesting insight into social value in real estate, and especially kind of the planning earlier stages as well. I'd also just like to take a moment to thank Amy, Rose and Mandy, who have been assisting behind the scenes, both in organisation and actually running today. It's greatly appreciated, and I'm grateful the tech has worked, or it's worked for me at least, so hopefully it has for all our attendees as well. Just in terms of the wider Women in Planning West Midlands Committee, we are currently in the process of pulling together an exciting programme of CPD and events for 2022. We will be keeping you all appraised of this via our kind of MailChimp updates. If you're not actually subscribed to those, you can do that on our Women in Planning website. But yeah, we'll keep you kind of appraised and updated of those as we go into the new year. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we wish you a Merry Christmas, and we'll see you after the festive break. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.